Under the pale morning light of May 29, 1944, somewhere in the cold mid-Atlantic, roughly 500 miles west of the Azores, Captain Laurent Detlev Krankenhagen guided U-549 through the darkness 600 feet below the surface. Down there, the ocean pressed in from every side like the weight of history itself, steady and immense. He believed he was safe. That depth had always been sanctuary, far below where most Allied depth charges could reach. Just before sunset, his Type WWII C-40 submarine had struck and destroyed the American escort carrier Block Island. It had been a clean, clinical operation, a precise application of skill and machinery honed by years of war. Yet now, less than an hour later, the hunter had become the hunted. Through the thin steel walls of the pressure hull, Krankenhagen could hear the world above him, the faint metallic rhythm of propellers turning in patient circles. American destroyer escorts swept the area, their engines tracing mechanical heartbeats through the sea. Every man aboard knew that sound. They had survived it before, the standard Allied counterattack, a deadly dance of depth charges that the German U-boat fleet had learned, painfully, to outwit. The tactics were burned into muscle memory. Drop to maximum depth, kill the engines, hold your breath, wait. Let the enemy lose sonar contact as they pass directly overhead, then shift course sharply, using those few precious seconds of blindness to slip away before the next attack began. It was a grim ritual shared across years of Atlantic warfare. The crew would sit in silence as the first charges fell, distant thuds that grew into thunder. Light bulbs trembled in their sockets. Gauges quivered. A fine rain of dust drifted down from seams in the bulkheads. But the boat held. It always held. They trusted in steel, in engineering, in discipline. If you're enjoying this deep dive into history, the calm voice of the narrator says, subscribe to WWII History Tales and tell us where in the world you're watching from. What Krankenhagen could not possibly have known, and what no German commander yet understood in May 1944, was that the rules of survival beneath the Atlantic had changed forever. Above them, one destroyer escort, USS Eugene E. Elmore, had kept perfect sonar contact, tracking U-549 as if the sea itself had turned transparent. Her new Type 144 sonar system could detect a submarine up to 3,000 yards away under ideal conditions, and that night, conditions were almost perfect. But it wasn't the sonar alone that sealed U-549's fate. Mounted on Elmore's forward deck was a weapon system German intelligence had only begun to whisper about, a strange, almost alien device known as the Hedgehog. At approximately 2100 hours, Lieutenant Commander G.L. Coney gave the order for the first attack run. 24 projectiles shot forward from the destroyer's bow in rapid succession, less than 2 seconds between launch and silence. Each bomb, 7 inches wide, 65 pounds in weight, carried a core of Torpex explosive that glimmered faintly under the deck lights before vanishing into the dark Atlantic. They fell in a circle 200 yards ahead of the ship, sinking swiftly toward the depths where UFM-49 waited. At 23.5 feet per second, the projectiles would reach that depth in about half a minute. Unlike the depth charges of old, these did not explode on command. They waited, patient, silent, until they struck solid metal. The first salvo missed. The bombs descended past the submarine, harmless, fading into the quiet abyss. Somewhere in that black pressure chamber, Krankenhagen likely felt a fragile spark of relief. Perhaps he even believed the worst had passed. But the Elmore did not lose contact. Her sonar men kept the trace clear on their screens, a thin, unwavering line of certainty. The destroyer swung around for a second run. 3 minutes to reload, another 24 Hedgehogs fired. 30 seconds later, 3 small detonations pulsed through the sonar, a dull, heavy trio of impacts that told the crew everything they needed to know. Direct hits. 4 minutes later came a final sound, deep and final. A crushing implosion that rolled through the Atlantic like distant thunder. U-549 was gone. All 55 souls aboard perished instantly, from the moment Elmore launched her second attack to the moment the ocean swallowed the last fragment of steel. Barely 4.5 minutes had passed. What happened that night marked a turning point, one few men understood until much later. It was not simply another U-boat lost. It was the death of an idea, the shattering of a belief that had carried German submariners through years of peril. In the spring of 1944, technology had quietly erased the tactical edge they had relied on since the war began, and that realization, the slow, creeping awareness that their old defenses no longer worked, would haunt every surviving U-boat crew through the final desperate year of the war. How do you fight an enemy you cannot hear, cannot see, and cannot escape before the strike arrives? To grasp the psychological impact of the Hedgehog on the men who served beneath the sea, one must understand what they believed before it appeared. By 1943, few illusions remained about the danger of submarine warfare. The Atlantic had already claimed thousands of German sailors, but those who remained possessed something equally powerful: knowledge, hard-earned, cruelly tested knowledge. For years, German U-boat doctrine had revolved around one essential truth: the Allied sonar's blind spot. British ASDIC and American sonar systems worked by sending out pulses of sound that bounced off submerged targets. They were effective, but imperfect. As an attacking vessel drew close, the time between pulse and echo grew shorter until, within roughly 200 yards, the returning signal merged with the outgoing one. The sonar went blind. In that invisible moment, directly beneath the attacker, the submarine vanished. It was in this space, this tiny pocket of uncertainty, that men like Krankenhagen found their hope. The instant an escort passed overhead, they would throw their boat into a sharp dive or turn, exploiting the few seconds when the enemy's instruments faltered. The destroyers, trusting to the last known position, would drop their charges into empty water. The mathematics of survival favored the submariner, if he remained calm. Allied depth charges, the Mark VI and Mark VII, sank slowly, 8 or 9 feet per second. To reach a submarine 300 feet below, they needed half a minute or more. In those 30 seconds, a good captain could change everything: his depth, his heading, even his sound profile. The charges exploded at preset depths, whether they found their mark or not, their blasts tearing at the ocean in vast, chaotic bubbles that momentarily blinded sonar for friend and foe alike. After an attack, the sea became a roaring blur of sound and turbulence. For 10 or 15 minutes, sonar was useless. In that noise, a disciplined U-boat could slip away into the silence, leaving only uncertainty behind. The German designs themselves embodied this confidence. The Type 7 and Type 9 boats were engineered not just to dive deep, but to endure. Their pressure hulls could survive down to 700 feet before the ocean's hand crushed them entirely. Captains seldom risked such depths, but the very knowledge of that strength lent them courage. A depth charge had to explode within 10 or 20 feet of the hull to inflict fatal damage, and even then the structure might hold, scarred but intact. The statistics supported the faith. British naval records later revealed that out of more than 5,000 depth charge attacks during the war, only about 85 resulted in confirmed U-boat kills, a success rate of barely 1 in 60. Many submarines endured hundreds of attacks during their service. Some survived storms of explosives that would have annihilated lesser craft. U-427, for example, famously endured 678 depth charges in April 1945 before limping back to base, battered but alive. Such stories spread through the fleet like quiet prayers. They told men that survival was possible, that discipline and courage mattered more than luck. They gave meaning to the endless nights beneath the waves. That belief, the fragile equilibrium between fear and faith, was what the Hedgehog destroyed. It replaced uncertainty with inevitability. It stripped the ocean of its hiding places. For Krankenhagen and his crew, the end came not with drama or flame, but with silence, the kind of silence that follows a great shift in history. In the darkness of the Atlantic, after the last echo faded from the sonar screens of Elmore, the sea rolled back into stillness. Only a faint shimmer of oil marked where U-549 had once prowled, as Sienki. Noise and purpose dissolved into the depths. And somewhere far above, under the indifferent stars, the water kept its rhythm, steady, endless, and unchanged. By the middle of the war, no one aboard a German U-boat believed they were untouchable. Those men understood far too well that the ocean had changed. The Atlantic, once a vast and silent ally, was now wired with listening ears and circling eyes. Every passing month brought new Allied tactics, sharper instruments, and tighter coordination between sea and sky. By 1943, the calm arrogance of the early years was gone. Convoy escorts no longer hunted alone. They worked in concert, a disciplined pack of destroyers and corvettes sweeping methodically through the dark, communicating, triangulating, learning. What had once been a chess game had become mathematics. The Allies had refined the art of detection to a science. Their sonar, long the fragile advantage of the hunter, now reached farther, listened deeper, painted clearer pictures of what lurked below. The air above, too, had grown dangerous. The appearance of escort carriers, bringing the eyes of aircraft over every convoy route, closed the last window of mobility for the German wolf packs. The vast ocean that once offered invisibility had turned into a trap, its surface patrolled, its depths illuminated by sound. May of 1943, Black May, as German submariners called it, was the month that truth arrived like a hammer blow. In those 31 days, 41 U-boats were lost. The number was more than German shipyards could replace, more than the Kriegsmarine could sustain. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, once the architect of the submarine campaign, was forced to withdraw his fleet from the North Atlantic convoy lanes. Even he, a man of cold logic and steel determination, knew the tide had turned. The hunters were no longer the masters of the deep. And yet, despite the mounting losses, German U-boat captains did not surrender their sense of agency. They still had their tactics, their deep knowledge of sonar's rhythms, its blind moments, its human operators who could err or hesitate. They believed that with precision, discipline, and a little luck, a good captain could still make it home. The Atlantic was wide beyond comprehension. Somewhere in that immensity, there had to be room for one more escape. This was the psychology that sustained them, the fragile balance between fear and control. They accepted danger as a constant companion. By war's end, out of roughly 40,000 men who served in U-boats, nearly 28,000 would perish, a 70% casualty rate. Yet even under those odds, there remained a difference between risk and certainty. Death was possible, not inevitable. Skill mattered, instinct mattered. A commander who knew his boat, his enemy, and the pulse of the sea might yet surface again under a pale northern dawn. The men had reason to believe this. For years, that belief had been true. But slowly, without their realizing it, the foundations of that confidence were eroding. A new weapon had entered the Allied arsenal, a quiet revolution that would take time to prove its worth. The Hedgehog. It sounded almost harmless, almost whimsical, like a creature rather than a weapon. Introduced by the Royal Navy in 1942, it looked more like a strange metal garden of spiked tubes mounted on the forward deck of an escort vessel than a piece of ordnance. Its promise was enormous, but in those early months, the results were disappointing. Success rates barely exceeded those of traditional depth charges. Captains used it sparingly, sometimes with skepticism, and British command grew frustrated. An order went out requiring officers to explain in writing why they had not employed the Hedgehog when engaging an enemy contact. Part of the problem was psychological. Depth charges, when dropped, gave the illusion of power, the grand concussion, the water erupting, the ship shaking from the echo of its own might. Even a missed attack felt productive. It made the crew feel they were striking back, punishing the unseen enemy. The Hedgehog, by contrast, offered nothing of the sort. When it missed, and early on it often did, it left no sound, no tremor, no confirmation that anything at all had happened. 24 projectiles would vanish into the water with a series of modest splashes, and then silence. The sea simply swallowed them. For sailors accustomed to thunder, that silence was unsettling, yet the brilliance of the weapon lay in that very stillness. The Hedgehog addressed, in one elegant stroke, the central flaw of all depth charge attacks, the blind spot. It could strike before the submarine slipped away. Its design was simple but transformative. 24 spigot mortars, arranged in 4 neat rows of 6, each angled to send its projectile in a precise forward arc. When fired, they formed a circular pattern roughly 130 feet across, landing about 200 yards ahead of the attacking vessel. That forward firing ability was the key. Depth charges had to be dropped from the stern, meaning that by the time they fell, the ship had already passed over the submarine and lost sonar contact. The Hedgehog broke that rule. It allowed the attacker to keep the target in sight, on the sonar screen, throughout the entire strike. No more blind window, no more guessing. The ocean's invisibility had been pierced. Each projectile was a small marvel of engineering. It had to endure the violent impact with the sea without detonating, and then, as it sank, a tiny propeller spun in the current to arm the fuse, only after it had dropped 50 feet below the surface. Then it waited. Upon striking solid metal, the charge detonated instantly. The explosive itself, Torpex, was 50% more powerful than TNT. Compact, deadly, efficient. The speed was astonishing. Sinking at over 23 feet per second, a projectile could reach 200 feet in less than 9 seconds. For a submarine operating at 300 feet, it took perhaps 13 seconds between the first splash above and the first impact below. 13 seconds. That was all the time a captain had to react. Depth charges, by contrast, took over half a minute to reach the same depth. Against the Hedgehog, there was no margin left for cleverness, no window to change course or depth. And unlike the broad concussions of depth charges, which could shake a submarine without destroying it, the Hedgehog was surgical. It did not explode unless it hit. There was no cushion of water to soften the blow. A single direct contact was enough to rupture a pressure hull, to end the fight completely. Even a strike on the outer casing could prove fatal. The concentrated blast, shattering valves, crushing compartments, or crippling control systems. By late 1943, the Allies had solved the early challenges that limited the weapon's potential. They trained their crews carefully, refining firing patterns, integrating sonar data into attack planning. A new generation of escort vessels carried combat information centers, rooms filled with glowing screens and headsets, where young technicians tracked sonar contacts and computed firing solutions in real time. The Hedgehog became not just a tool, but part of a system, a seamless network of detection, calculation, and execution. When the new Type 144 sonar appeared, it sealed the transformation. Its precision allowed contact to be maintained at closer ranges and greater depths than ever before. The ocean's last refuge had vanished. By the war's end, the numbers told their own quiet story. Hedgehog attacks achieved roughly 1 kill for every 5 engagements, a 20% success rate. Depth charges, in contrast, remained pitifully inefficient, 1 success in 80. British records listed 268 Hedgehog attacks, 47 confirmed submarine kills. For naval warfare, that ratio was revolutionary. The United States Navy soon adopted the weapon as part of the reverse Lend-Lease program. Their new destroyer escorts, smaller than fleet destroyers, but stronger and faster than corvettes, were designed around the Hedgehog's capabilities. By 1944, these vessels were the backbone of Allied anti-submarine warfare, operating not just in the Atlantic, but across the Pacific as well. One name became legend: USS England. In May 1944, she sank 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days, using the Hedgehog almost exclusively. 6 victories, 12 days. No other ship in history matched that record. It was proof, not theory, that the weapon worked, devastatingly so. When skill, technology, and coordination aligned, the ocean offered no escape. For the men of the German U-Bootwaffe, however, understanding that such a weapon existed was not the same as understanding what it meant. Reports filtered back through command channels, vague descriptions of forward-firing anti-submarine mortars, rumors of contact-detonated explosives. But few grasped the deeper implications, that these weapons erased the blind spot, that their sinking speed made evasion nearly impossible, and that their silence on a miss allowed the attacker to maintain sonar lock and strike again, perfectly adjusted. By the time those details reached the training schools and flotilla briefings, it was too late. The ocean had already changed. In the final months of the war, the U-boat arm continued to fight with courage and precision, but against an enemy that no longer played by the old rules. They still followed procedures honed through years of survival: dive deep, go silent, wait for the noise to fade. But the noise no longer faded. It lingered, constant and knowing. For Captain Laurent Detlev Krankenhagen and his crew aboard U-549, the lesson came too swiftly to learn. On that late May evening in 1944, they discovered in their final moments what the rest of the fleet would only come to understand afterward: that all the old wisdom, all the tactics passed down through years of hard experience, had been rendered meaningless by a weapon that erased time, silence, and chance itself. And somewhere in the depths that night, after the last echo faded, the sea absorbed another secret, quiet, absolute, and eternal. The assumptions that once guided the German submarine crews, their understanding of how to survive beneath the waves, were being quietly rewritten in the minds of British engineers. What eventually became the Hedgehog system did not emerge from some grand naval arsenal or elite laboratory, but from a small, cluttered office belonging to the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development. Its members were a curious band of thinkers, half scientists, half dreamers, who earned the nickname the Weezers and Dodgers for their stubbornly unconventional methods. They were not men who followed the book. They were men who wrote new pages when the old ones failed. It was Commander Charles Goodeve of the Royal Navy who first envisioned the idea of a forward-throwing mortar in the spring of 1940. To him, the problem with depth charges wasn't a lack of explosive power, it was how that power was used. You could shake the sea with violence, but if you struck too late, all you did was churn water and lose the scent of your quarry. Turning that insight into a working weapon, however, was another matter entirely. The technical challenge was immense. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker had, before the war, developed the spigot mortar, an unusual system in which the propelling charge stayed fixed within the weapon, while a steel rod, the spigot, fit into a hollow tail on the projectile. It had worked well enough for infantry mortars and anti-tank weapons, but adapting that principle to a naval environment meant wrestling with forces of pressure, salt, and motion that had defeated earlier designs. The first true attempt, the Fairley mortar tested aboard HMS Whitehall in 1941, was a complete disappointment. Its iron-nosed shells carried too little explosive, barely 20 pounds, and its tail-fused design meant the detonation lagged fatally behind impact. Accuracy was poor, range inadequate, and even a perfect strike rarely pierced a U-boat's thick-pressure hull. Goodeve's team went back to the drawing board. They reimagined the weapon from tip to tail, installing a contact fuse in the nose and packing each round with 35 pounds of Torpex, an explosive nearly half again as powerful as TNT. They redesigned the tail to stabilize flight and descent, and they flattened the projectile's nose, learning through hundreds of tests that a blunt shape cut into the sea cleanly rather than skipping like a stone. The real art lay in the fuse. It had to be sensitive enough to detonate on contact with a steel hull, yet strong enough to survive the violent shock of entering the water at terminal velocity. To solve this, the engineers built a tiny propeller into the nose. As it spun during descent, it gradually armed the fuse about 50 feet down, so the projectile would never detonate prematurely. When it met a surface harder than silt or sand, the mechanism triggered instantly, releasing its full charge of Torpex in a single, devastating pulse. Information about German submarine construction was scarce and tightly held, but the British engineers were nothing if not resourceful. One of them stumbled upon an Italian naval magazine that, by chance or carelessness, had printed photographs of German shipyards. In one image, a worker stood on the curved back of a U-boat. By measuring the man's leg length and accounting for perspective, the team deduced the distance between the outer casing and the pressure hull, a critical detail in determining whether 35 pounds of Torpex would punch through both layers. It was science done with the cunning of spies and a touch of luck. To refine the weapon's spread pattern, they built a miniature test range. Using what looked like a roulette wheel holding a small model submarine, they launched tiny projectiles at varying angles, recording thousands of impacts. Gradually, a pattern emerged, a circular strike zone about 130 feet wide, with each projectile spaced roughly 18 feet apart, gave the best odds of hitting a submarine even if it twisted away during those few, tense seconds between launch and impact. When HMS Westcott received the prototype in 1941, the weapon finally had a name, Hedgehog, and the first real sea trials began. The results, at first, were disappointing. Despite installation on over 100 ships, No confirmed kills came in that first year. North Atlantic storms drenched the launchers in seawater, shorting out electrical circuits and causing incomplete salvos. In rough seas, aiming was guesswork at best. And then there was the strangest problem of all: the silence. Depth charges, successful or not, filled the sky with thunder and geysers of white water. They gave crews a sense of power, of striking back. Hedgehog, on the other hand, made only 24 small splashes, then nothing but silence. If it missed, there was no explosion, no plume, no reassurance that the enemy had even noticed the attempt. That silence gnawed at morale. To the men who manned the ships, it felt as if they were firing hope into the sea. Royal Navy leadership, to their credit, did not abandon the experiment. Instead, they leaned into it with a quiet persistence that had carried them through darker times. In early 1943, a representative from the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, an engineer more teacher than officer, traveled to Londonderry, where the Atlantic escort fleet was based. He went from ship to ship, patiently retraining crews, explaining not just how the weapon worked, but why it mattered. He told them that silence was not a flaw, but a gift. A missed depth charge blinded sonar operators for 15 minutes or more, the echo of its own blast, drowning out all other sounds. Hedgehog, by contrast, left the sea quiet. The sonar could listen continuously, track the submarine as it tried to flee, and guide the next attack with precision. He reminded them that the weapon's circular pattern had been designed to anticipate the submarine's movement during descent, and that they must aim not ahead or behind, but exactly where the enemy lay at the moment of firing. Above all, he said, if a Hedgehog exploded, that meant a direct hit, almost certainly a kill. There was no maybe with this weapon. Slowly, confidence returned. Crews began to trust the strange device. The results followed soon after. By late 1943, the improvements spread through the entire Allied anti-submarine effort. Combat Information Centers, CICs, were introduced aboard escort vessels, changing how information flowed in battle. No longer did the captain stand on the bridge, shouting for sonar bearings relayed through narrow tubes and half heard in the wind. Now, beneath the bridge, in a dimly lit room filled with soft glowing screens, every piece of tactical data came together: sonar, radar, navigation, ship speed, merged into one living map. The sea itself seemed to speak through those green-lit dials. With this integration, the Hedgehog found its full potential. Captains could adjust their course in real time, maintain sonar lock during the attack, and fire with accuracy that would have been unthinkable only a year before. And when those 24 mortars left their cradle, 6 in each row, leaping forward in perfect unison, the sound was unlike anything else at sea. Not thunder, not roar, but a sharp, disciplined rhythm, a breath, then silence, followed by the faint hiss of metal descending through cold water. That silence, once dreaded, became the Allies' advantage. Where before the ocean had favored the hunter below, it now lent its quiet to those above. The Hedgehog had transformed not just the tools of war, but the very psychology of it. It rewarded patience, calculation, and faith in invisible science over spectacle. By 1944, the lessons learned aboard those first cold rolling decks had turned into doctrine. Crews knew that Hedgehog was no mere replacement for depth charges. It was a revolution in underwater warfare. The old thunder had given way to something colder, sharper, more precise. A weapon born not from rage, but from reasoning. And out on the endless Atlantic, where sonar pings echoed like distant heartbeats, that reasoning whispered its truth in silence. The kind of silence that meant a submarine had just met the end it could neither see nor hear coming. The fire control system had evolved into something that seemed almost alive. It no longer relied on the old manual computations or the slow rhythm of human intuition. Instead, it drew directly from sonar pulses echoing through the sea, each return signal feeding a chain of calculations that factored depth, speed, bearing, and even the attack ship's own motion. Every echo meant data. Every sound became geometry. Within seconds, the system predicted not just where a German U-boat was, but where it would be. To the men of the Kriegsmarine, who had once relied on stealth and instinct, this unseen mathematics felt like sorcery. U-boat commanders began encountering this new force without realizing that the very equation of undersea warfare had been rewritten. In May of 1945, Kapitän-Leutnant Helmut Sommer, commander of U-853, patrolled the cold waters off the American East Coast. The European war was in its final fading days, though few men at sea could yet feel peace in their bones. Sommer had survived an air attack nearly a year earlier, when British aircraft had raked his submarine near the surface. Against the odds, he had brought his wounded vessel home and volunteered to return. His second patrol would reveal just how completely the tide had turned, how the hunter had become the hunted. On May 5, 1945, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz transmitted an order to all remaining U-boats: cease offensive operations. Germany's surrender was only hours away. Whether U-853 ever received that message, or whether Sommer chose silence over surrender, remains one of those details history will never settle. What is known is this. On May 6th, off Point Judith, Rhode Island, the submarine torpedoed and sank the American collier SS Black Point. It was the last merchant vessel ever destroyed by German action in American waters. The response was swift and absolute. Within minutes, destroyer escorts USS Atherton and USS Moberly, along with several smaller craft, converged on the site. Lieutenant Commander Louis Iselin aboard Atherton made the first sonar contact around 8:30 that evening. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a hunt. It lasted through the night and into the early hours of May 7th, but the outcome was never really in doubt once contact was established. At 8:30 p.m., Atherton released 13 magnetic depth charges. One detonated with a low, distant boom. Whether it struck the submarine or one of the countless wrecks littering the shallow Rhode Island seabed, the crew above could not tell. Below, Sommer maneuvered through the turbulence, guiding his boat like a wounded animal slipping into deeper shadow. U-853 surfaced again on sonar around 11:43 that night, now 4,000 yards east of its previous position. Dead in the water, engines silent, resting around 100 feet down. Inside the steel hull, the air grew hot and stale. Electric bulbs, already trembling in their sockets, shattered under the shock of earlier blasts. Glass gauges cracked, dials spun uselessly. Thin leaks began whispering at the seams. Every man aboard knew the rule. Silence meant life. Even the sound of a loose bolt could be a death sentence. They waited, as they had been trained to do, for the escorts to lose contact, to slip into that brief blind spot when the sea's geometry confused the sonar beams. Then they would move. But the Americans had mastered the art of persistence. Around 2 a.m., Moberly executed a hedgehog run. The sea erupted with the muted rhythm of metals striking water in a perfect circle. Most of the projectiles sank quietly into the dark. 3 did not. They found U-853's pressure hull and exploded with the combined energy of precision and inevitability. What happened next depended on where those 3 small warheads struck. If they pierced the pressure hull cleanly, death came in an instant, a flash of pressure and heat as seawater collapsed inward faster than thought. The air itself would have compressed violently, the temperature spiking high enough to ignite paint, oil, or cloth. For men near the point of impact, it ended before awareness could form. For others, it might have lasted a breath longer, a rush of noise, a flicker of light, and then nothing at all. But if the explosions ruptured only the outer casing, sparing the inner hull for a few agonizing moments, the end would have been slower. The crew would have known. They would have felt the tilt, the changing angle of the deck beneath their boots, as ballast tanks flooded unevenly. At 100 feet, they had perhaps 4 minutes before the ocean reached the point of no return, before the hull met its crush depth, somewhere beyond 700 feet. 4 minutes to understand the truth of their fate as steel groaned and rivets began to scream under stress. Thin trickles of water became high-pressure jets, cutting through the air like needles. The temperature climbed, lights flickered and died. Then came the sound that sonar operators later described, a deep, singular crunch, neither explosion nor echo, but something final. The sea had closed its hand around them. No one aboard U-853 survived. All 55 men perished in silence. Yet their loss was not an isolated tragedy. It was part of a pattern, one that had been building since 1944. The Allies had learned, adapted, and refined their craft until anti-submarine warfare became a science. The culmination came in April and May of 1945 with Operation Teardrop, a coordinated effort to intercept a final wave of German U-boats believed to be heading for the American coast, perhaps armed with V weapons or other last-resort technology. Intelligence intercepts suggested a group of Type 9 submarines, code-named Gruppe Seawolf, was making the crossing. The U.S. Navy responded by deploying two immense barrier forces across the Atlantic. The first comprised 20 destroyer escorts, divided between northern and southern patrol lines, each group supported by an escort carrier. The second barrier added two more carriers and 22 escorts. These ships fanned out across the mid-Atlantic like a net woven from steel and patience, guided by intelligence decrypted from German Enigma transmissions. Unaware that their codes had long been compromised, the Germans continued sending detailed orders in clear confidence. Allied codebreakers read those messages almost as fast as the intended U-boat commanders. The result was devastating precision. Just before midnight, on April 15, 1945, USS Stanton picked up radar contact, U-1235, running on the surface. Stanton attacked immediately, forcing the U-boat to dive. Joined by USS Frost, the two destroyers tracked their quarry through the night, making multiple Hedgehog attacks. The third, near midnight on April 16th, struck home. U-1235 vanished beneath the surface with all 56 hands. Barely 40 minutes later, less than 2 miles away, Frost detected another contact, U-880. The submarine had approached unnoticed during the earlier attack, perhaps hoping to counterstrike. Searchlights caught its conning tower. Small caliber fire stitched brief sparks across its hull before it slipped below. For the rest of the night, Frost, Stanton, and USS Hughes pursued the contact. At 4 a.m., another spread of Hedgehogs detonated. The sea convulsed, then went still. U-880 and her 52-man crew were gone. Both attacks produced explosions far greater than expected, bursts that dwarfed the normal force of a 35-pound Torpex charge. Some American commanders feared this confirmed the presence of experimental weapons aboard the submarines. Orders went out: destroy every remaining contact before it could approach the coast. Later, intelligence would reveal that neither U-boat carried such weapons. The massive detonations had come from within, the sympathetic explosion of torpedo warheads, air flasks, or fuel tanks ignited by the Hedgehog hits. For the men listening on sonar, it made little difference. Each contact ended the same way: a tremor, a burst of static, then silence. And above the cold Atlantic, as dawn crept over the gray water, the sea once again looked calm, its surface smooth, betraying nothing of what had just passed beneath it. Only a few drifting bubbles, and the slow, fading echo of steel collapsing into the deep remained, dissolving into the rhythm of the tide. The Atlantic War had entered its final and most merciless phase. On April 22nd, near midnight, USS Carter and USS Neil A. Scott found U-518 and finished her after hours of coordinated pursuit. Their Hedgehog attacks struck with mathematical precision. The sea briefly lifted, then folded back over itself. 55 men vanished without a trace. 2 days later, on April 24th, USS Flaherty hunted U-546 for nearly 10 relentless hours before scoring fatal hits. The submarine was forced to the surface, wounded but defiant. Deck guns opened fire from the escorts, Flaherty and 3 others, until the boat slipped beneath the waves for the last time. 33 men survived, including Captain Lieutenant Paul Just, and were taken prisoner. Their faces, hollow and dazed, told the story of men who had looked into the mechanical face of inevitability. Some of them endured harsh questioning from U.S. intelligence officers desperate to learn whether the submarine had carried secret weapons meant for attacks on American cities. None had. But in those cold interrogation rooms, the human cost of a vanishing war became unmistakably clear. By that spring, the pattern was visible to anyone who studied the reports piling up on both sides of the Atlantic. The Hedgehog, a strange, unassuming name for such a weapon, had rewritten the physics of underwater warfare. Submarines that might once have slipped away from depth charge attacks were now destroyed within minutes once sonar contact was made. The new weapon erased the old blind spot that German doctrine depended upon. It struck forward, not from behind. It listened as it killed. The difference lay in time, seconds instead of minutes. With depth charges, U-boat commanders had once played a deadly game of geometry, turning sharply, diving fast, trying to exploit that brief window between detection and detonation. But Hedgehog gave them no such mercy. Its projectiles traveled quickly, exploded only on direct contact, and that contact meant almost certain destruction. The reports that surviving U-boat commanders brought home grew darker with each patrol. They described sonar pings that never faded, explosions that came from impossible angles, and weapons that seemed to think faster than men could act. Traditional tactics, diving deep, running silent, cutting engines, waiting for the sound of the escort to pass overhead, no longer worked. Some Allied ships could now maintain sonar contact at depths once thought unreachable. Attacks came not only from above, but from ahead, arriving before the submarine could change course. And when the explosions came, they didn't echo through the water like before. They struck with a brutal intimacy, metal against metal, energy focused into a single instant. To the men inside, it must have felt like the ocean itself had turned into a weapon. Inside German Naval Command, confusion reigned. Intelligence analysts tried to piece together reports from shattered patrols, half-finished messages, and the scattered words of survivors. They knew now that a forward-firing anti-submarine system existed, one that used contact fuses rather than proximity detonations. But they did not yet understand how fully it was integrated, how the improved sonar systems fed it precise firing data, how the forward attack pattern removed any dead time, and how its rapid descent rate compressed the entire engagement into moments. By the time the picture came into focus, the damage was already irreversible. The once proud U-Boot-Waffe, which had threatened entire oceans, was now cornered, strangled by mathematics and machinery it had not yet learned to counter. The statistics told the story in their cold precision. During the war, British forces conducted over 5,000 depth charge attacks, achieving 85 confirmed submarine kills, a success ratio of about 1 in 60. The Hedgehog, by contrast, achieved 47 kills in just 268 attacks, roughly 1 in 6. By the war's final year, that ratio tightened further, 1 kill for every 5 attacks, a 20-fold improvement. It was not just a new weapon, it was a revolution beneath the sea. American forces soon matched these results. Once U.S. crews mastered sonar coordination and the rhythm of the new firing patterns, Hedgehog became the silent reaper of the Atlantic. 11 of the last 16 German submarines destroyed by American escorts fell to this system. Its effectiveness extended to the Pacific as well. In May 1944, the destroyer escort USS England achieved an almost mythic record: 6 Japanese submarines destroyed in 12 days. RO-105, RO-18, RO-106, RO-104, RO-116, and RO-107. The numbers alone sounded unreal, but they were true. Commander Charles Goodeve's awkward-looking device with its cluster of spiked projectiles, mocked by some in its early days, had become the most lethal anti-submarine weapon of the war. For the men of the U-Boot-Waffe, the consequences were personal, not statistical. Casualty rates among submariners, already staggering, grew catastrophic. Of roughly 40,000 men who served in German submarines during the war, 28,000 never returned, more than 70%. No other branch in any nation suffered such loss. The ocean became both their battleground and their grave. The new technology did not just destroy boats, it broke something deeper inside the men who sailed them. For years, German doctrine had insisted that courage, skill, and quick thinking could outmatch Allied numbers. A disciplined captain could still outwit his enemy, even in defeat. That belief gave the service its grim pride. It allowed men to climb into steel tubes and descend into the dark with purpose. But Hedgehog erased that fragile faith. It left no room for decision, no margin for courage. The projectiles came from ahead, not from above. The sonar contact never broke, and once detected, the end followed in seconds. Human reaction time simply could not compete. The change was psychological as much as tactical. Before, there had been hope. Even in the face of impossible odds, men believed that survival rested partly in their own hands. Now, that illusion was gone. Surviving commanders spoke of the quiet despair that crept through their crews in 1944 and 1945. Determination hardened into fatalism. Men went to sea with the understanding that they were unlikely to return. The math alone said as much. A new submarine, setting out for its first patrol in the war's final months, had a single-digit chance of survival. Those odds weighed heavier than any depth charge. Herbert Werner, a commander who lived through it, captured the mood in his memoir, Iron Coffins. His words are not those of bitterness, but of exhausted memory. He wrote of the silence before departure, how crews avoided talking about the future, how laughter felt forced, how even the youngest among them carried the look of men twice their age. Once at sea, the waiting began. The endless listening, the counting of seconds between distant explosions, the faint drip of water from stressed hull plates. They learned to read those sounds as one might read a heartbeat, knowing that one wrong rhythm could mean the end. And then there were the attacks that came without warning, without even the courtesy of sound. No propeller noise, no gradual crescendo of sonar pings, just sudden, perfect impact, metal striking metal, followed instantly by silence. Those moments, Werner said, were the worst. Not because of fear, but because there was no time left to be afraid. The Hedgehog took away the gradual rise of tension that at least gave men the illusion of control. There was no more waiting, no counting between blasts, no desperate maneuver that might turn the tide. Only the sudden certainty that the sea had made its decision. For those few who survived damaged, the knowledge lingered that next time there would be no escape. By the closing months of 1945, the WWII no longer existed as a strategic force. The oceans that had once echoed with their conning towers now carried only the hum of Allied patrols. The last submarines slipped quietly into the deep, their crews gone, their signals fading into static. The ocean kept its secrets well, and when dawn touched the waves, it seemed to whisper, soft and low, over waters that were finally, mercifully, still. Donitz kept sending his submarines to sea long after logic said to stop. Some of it was calculation. He knew that if he withdrew them entirely, the Allied navies would suddenly have thousands of ships and aircraft free to strike elsewhere. Some of it was momentum. An institution that had lived and bled beneath the waves for 6 years could not simply stop moving. And some of it was hope, thin, desperate hope, that the new generation of U-boats equipped with the snorkel breathing tube might somehow restore the balance. They did not. By the time the war ended, the once proud submarine pens along the French coast lay shattered or captured, and the few operational boats that remained were scattered across Norwegian fjords and Baltic ports. Their crews were mostly boys now, hurriedly trained replacements, standing in for the veterans who had vanished beneath the sea over 4 years of relentless attrition. The story of the Hedgehog weapon system reaches far beyond the surface reports and cold statistics that describe its kills. It became, in retrospect, a case study in how small, almost unremarkable innovations, when properly integrated into tactics and matched with patient training, can reshape the nature of warfare itself. The Hedgehog was not born of brilliance or magic. It was a mechanical contrivance, nothing more than a spigot mortar adapted for ships, firing a spread of small projectiles that sank through water and detonated only on contact. No electronics, no guidance, just geometry, pressure, and timing. Yet when paired with new sonar precision and disciplined crews, that simple idea turned devastating. It worked because it closed the interval between detection and strike, because it married the ear that could hear with the hand that could strike. The concept sounds simple now, almost inevitable, but its path to success was anything but smooth. Early tests disappointed. The new weapon barely outperformed conventional depth charges, and the sailors distrusted it. Technical flaws caused misfires. The aiming systems felt awkward. The projectiles sometimes failed to detonate. Among the lower decks, there were mutters that this strange contraption would never replace the thunderous reassurance of a depth charge pattern. A less patient Navy might have abandoned it there, written it off as an overcomplicated toy and gone back to the methods that at least felt familiar. But the Royal Navy did not. Instead, British engineers and officers studied the failures carefully, stripping away excuses until the truth emerged. The weapon itself was sound. It was the training, the coordination with sonar, and the understanding of timing that were lacking. And so, they began again. Crews were retrained. Sonar operators drilled until instinct and machine spoke the same language. Slowly, the results turned. Gradually, success began to speak louder than doubt. When the Americans received the Hedgehog design through reverse lend-lease, it became a symbol of how the Allied powers shared not just material, but trust. Britain, having spent dearly in both money and lives to perfect the weapon, offered its plans freely to its partner across the Atlantic. The U.S. Navy adopted and refined it, producing its own versions, including the Mousetrap, a smaller launcher designed for patrol vessels that lacked the space for the full installation. In these exchanges, one can see the essence of Allied cooperation, each nation lending its strength to cover the other's weakness, an economy of innovation that contrasted sharply with the rigid compartmentalization inside the Axis powers. In Germany and Japan alike, rivalries between the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine, or between the Imperial Army and Navy, often stifled collaboration that might have made a difference. The Allies, meanwhile, learned to build together, and in that unity lay quiet power. The tactical revolution sparked by the Hedgehog reached far beyond the war that birthed it. It established a new doctrine, one that remains at the core of anti-submarine warfare to this day. Never lose contact. Attack while the target is still seen, still heard, still pinned in the invisible grid of sonar. Eliminate the blind time, the fatal pause between detection and destruction. That principle, born of necessity in the gray North Atlantic, shaped every weapon that followed. Britain's Squid and Limbo mortars, America's acoustic homing torpedoes like the Mark 46, and the later systems that could think and steer on their own. Each carried forward that same idea, that victory at sea belonged not to the biggest explosion, but to the weapon that could listen while it struck. For German naval thinkers reflecting after the war, the Hedgehog became one painful piece of a larger realization, that their enemy's advantage was not one single device, but the seamless integration of many. The Allies had fused radar, sonar, aircraft, code-breaking, and training into a single, self-reinforcing machine of war. No matter how skillful the U-boat captains, they were now fighting mathematics as much as men. To imagine the scope of that integration is to glimpse the scale of the defeat. Radar found submarines running on the surface at night. High-frequency direction finders intercepted their radio signals. Escort carriers provided constant air cover across the mid-Atlantic, once the U-boat's safest hunting ground. Sonar guided attacks from below, while Enigma decrypts allowed Allied commanders to anticipate where the next wolfpack would strike. Convoys were rerouted, traps laid, hunter-killer groups dispatched with chilling precision. In that lattice of technology and intelligence, the German U-boats were ensnared before they ever reached their patrol zones. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of the U-boat war, and later Hitler's successor in the Reich's dying days, spent years afterward trying to understand what had gone wrong. His post-war writings reveal a man struggling to reconcile brilliance with blindness. He recognized that Allied code-breaking had turned his advantage inside out. His submarines were sailing into ambushes set with their own orders. He acknowledged that escort carriers had closed the air gap, where U-boats once ruled unchallenged, and that sonar had reached a level of accuracy that made concealment nearly impossible. But even then, Dönitz could not quite accept that the tide had turned irreversibly, not through one misstep, but through the sheer cumulative weight of Allied industry and adaptation. He kept believing that a different tactic, a new type of submarine, perhaps a better trained crew, might have restored the balance. It was the same hope that had sent young men out on patrol when all reason said to keep them home. That refusal to accept that the equation itself had changed ran deep in the German command. Many officers, across all branches, shared the same blindness. They acknowledged the enemy's strengths one by one, yet never fully accepted how those strengths, combined and coordinated, rendered Germany's situation hopeless. The price of that denial was written not in theories, but in names, tens of thousands of them. Crews kept sailing in the final months of the war, knowing their missions could no longer change its outcome. Submarines that might have stayed safely in port left instead on one-way journeys, their departure orders signed in the fading ink of delusion. The courage of those men was real and beyond question, but courage without purpose becomes tragedy. They died because their leaders could not admit that the war beneath the waves was already lost. Consider again that night, May 29, 1944, When U-549 disappeared beneath the North Atlantic, all hands lost. Kapitän-Leutnant Detlev Krankenhagen commanded her, a modern boat with a disciplined crew. He understood the playbook of anti-submarine warfare as well as any man alive. When the sonar pings came and the ocean began to tremble, he followed doctrine to the letter. Dive deep, cut the engines, run silent. Wait for the escort to pass overhead, then maneuver in the blind spot left behind. These tactics had saved countless submarines in the earlier years of the war. Every decision he made that night was correct, by the old rules. But the old rules no longer applied. The Allied escort above him did not lose sonar contact. The technology had advanced beyond what German manuals imagined possible. The attack that followed came not from behind, but from ahead, from a weapon designed to strike into the future position of its prey. The interval between detection and impact, once half a minute, was now a handful of seconds. In that brief span, the crew had no time to react, no chance to surface, no warning except the soundless arrival of fate. The sea gave no echo back. It simply closed over the place where they had been. And that, perhaps, is the deepest irony of the Hedgehog story. Those submariners were not defeated for lack of bravery or skill. They were men of exceptional discipline and endurance, fighting a war that demanded both. What failed them was not spirit, but the invisible mathematics of change, the shift in how war was fought and understood. The framework that had once rewarded courage and cunning had been rewritten by technology, by doctrine, by an enemy that learned faster than they could adapt. Their knowledge, once a shield, had become a trap. The last U-boats sailed, knowing the odds. Some went anyway, because duty still meant something even in the face of futility. Others because the orders said to go, and obedience was all they had left. When those final signals faded into static and the Atlantic settled back into stillness, the ocean itself seemed to exhale. In the silence, one might imagine hearing the faint creak of a hull far below, slowly surrendering to the weight of water, a soft, almost human sound, like metal remembering breath. Maneuvering during descent, trusting the steel of the hull, and waiting out the storm of charges, these had once been the sacred rites of survival beneath the waves. For years, those instincts kept German submariners alive, turning skill and intuition into shields stronger than armor. But now, those same instincts had become their undoing. The very wisdom that once saved them had turned into a fatal illusion. What was once survival knowledge had hardened into a trap, an echo of courage caught in the machinery of change. The story here isn't just one of machines triumphing over men. It is a study in psychology, in how belief and doctrine can betray even the bravest hearts. The German submariners were not overwhelmed by a sudden avalanche of superior numbers, though the Allies' industrial might was very real and immense. What truly defeated them was invisible, the collapse of assumptions that had quietly guided their every move. They were fighting inside a playbook that no longer applied, executing perfect maneuvers for a world that had already changed its rules. And they only discovered that change in the instant it destroyed them. This pattern, the tragic lag between innovation and adaptation, repeats endlessly across the pages of military history. Cavalrymen once charged machine guns with sabers raised, believing momentum could still outmatch bullets. Mighty fortress cities, whose walls had stood for centuries, crumbled when modern artillery taught stone the meaning of fragility. Even the great battleships of the world's navies, once the monarchs of the ocean, became obsolete when aircraft carriers struck them from beyond the horizon, invisible and untouchable. Again and again, the nature of war shifts silently beneath the feet of those who fight it. And each time, men die, not because they lacked courage, but because they trusted a world that no longer existed. The Hedgehog was a perfect expression of that truth. It was not grand or revolutionary in appearance, a cluster of simple tubes firing contact-fused projectiles into the sea. But its genius lay in what it destroyed, not just physically, but conceptually. It erased the blind spot, that precious pocket of safety beneath a destroyer where U-boats had always found shelter. It collapsed the reaction time from half a minute to mere seconds, and it required only a single hit to end the contest entirely. In one design stroke, it stripped away every margin the U-boat captains had once relied upon. A commander could execute flawless evasive maneuvers, follow every tenet of the Kriegsmarine's doctrine, and still be doomed, because that doctrine had been written for a battlefield that no longer existed beneath him. For the 28,000 German submariners who perished during the war, many in its final 18 months when Hedgehog and similar weapons had become widespread, the tragedy ran deeper than loss itself. They did not die simply from explosions in the deep, but from the inertia of a system unable to recognize its own defeat. The human cost was the sum of decisions made too late, of doctrines adjusted too slowly, of intelligence filtered through bureaucracy until it arrived stale and irrelevant. Their courage was never in doubt. What failed them was the structure that sent them out again and again, long after the ocean had become a graveyard rather than a battlefield. German naval intelligence lagged fatally behind the pace of change. Reports from surviving crews came too slowly, often misunderstood or dismissed. The training academies continued to teach methods designed for an earlier phase of the war, while Allied tactics evolved with relentless speed. Inside the steel corridors of command, old habits persisted. Orders still went out for patrols that could no longer affect the outcome of the conflict, missions that drained men and machines alike, feeding a cycle of loss disguised as duty. Each submarine that left port carried not just torpedoes and charts, but the quiet weight of inevitability. If one wanted proof that the nature of war itself had transformed, it could be found in the numbers. By war's end, Hedgehog crews recorded an average of 1 confirmed kill for every 5 attacks. In comparison, depth charges, a weapon once seen as the pinnacle of anti-submarine warfare, averaged 1 kill for every 60. Behind those ratios lay something profound, the triumph of precision over volume, of coordination over brute force. Yet statistics cannot capture what those changes felt like from below the surface. For the men inside those U-boats, being hunted by a weapon they did not yet understand must have felt like facing an ocean that had suddenly learned to think. The familiar rhythms of pursuit and evasion, pings, turns, dives, and silence, no longer worked. The rules of the deep had been rewritten, and the sea itself seemed to betray them. Imagine that realization, the moment a man understands that everything he knows about staying alive is now wrong. The instincts honed by countless patrols become meaningless. The comforting logic of cause and effect, do this, survive, evaporates. In its place, only uncertainty remains, and with it, a kind of hollow calm. There is no anger in that moment, only clarity. It is the ultimate collision of truth and belief, when experience meets evolution and loses. On the morning of May 29, 1944, Kapitän-Leutnant Detlev Krankenhagen commanded U-549 with the quiet confidence of a man who trusted his craft and his crew. The Atlantic was cold, metallic gray beneath low clouds, and the air carried the electric scent of coming rain. Below decks, every man knew his role. Every movement was a ritual of discipline. Krankenhagen believed, as he always had, that his skill, his training, and his crew's composure would see them through. And for a brief time, the world seemed to agree. The sonar pings faded. The escort ships moved on. The familiar rhythm of silence returned. Then, 4.5 minutes later, USS Elmore's second Hedgehog salvo entered the water. In those 4.5 minutes lies everything this story is about, the fragile line between belief and truth. The U-boat that had trusted in skill and tradition vanished almost instantly, consumed not by power alone, but by the quiet precision of new understanding. The crew never knew that the rules had changed. They never saw the shape of the weapon that struck them. One moment they were sailors at their stations, executing every step as doctrine demanded. The next, they were gone, swallowed by the same ocean that had been their world. Between those two moments, the war at sea was distilled into its purest form, not heroism or hatred, but the silent arithmetic of adaptation. Every innovation, every failure, every stubborn belief that refused to yield to reality, it all converged there, in the time it took for one pattern of sound to end and another to begin. The distance between what men believe and what the world has already become can be measured in seconds or in lives. That is the enduring lesson of U-549, and of all those who shared her fate. The sea does not care for courage, nor does it reward tradition. It obeys only the logic of change, and when that logic shifts, even the strongest steel and the bravest hearts can find themselves unprepared. For the submariners of Germany's Kriegsmarine, their end was not written in defeat alone, but in the quiet refusal to see that the war they were fighting had already moved on without them. And somewhere out there, beneath a gray and endless sky, the ocean still holds their silence, a faint echo beneath the waves, like a breath drawn in and never released.